The first time I saw my own reference number circled in red ink, the room felt suddenly smaller. A single miswritten digit in my ledger had left an entire landing built on craft that did not exist. While officers argued over tables and tides, I sat with the signal in my hands, knowing exactly where it should have gone. No shots were fired, no ramps dropped, yet I still carry the weight of an operation that died in my in-tray. In the late summer of 1943, on the south coast of England, another amphibious plan moved through the paperwork of Allied headquarters. The beaches were quiet, the offices were not. Britain had become a vast staging ground for operations by sea. From small commando raids to full-scale invasions, every proposal began on paper. The plan at the centre of this story was not the largest, and it aimed at a modest harbour on the enemy-held coastline, a minor port with a rail line and fuel tanks behind it. The intent was straightforward: land a reinforced brigade, seize the harbour, destroy supplies and infrastructure, withdraw before the enemy could concentrate a counterattack. It would never happen. Its traces survive mainly in files, signals, and marginal notes. The men who trained for it remembered only the landing that never came. At a corps headquarters a few miles inland, the amphibious section occupied a cramped set of rooms in an old requisitioned building. Maps covered the walls, tide tables, beach gradients, and annotated aerial photographs filled the desks. Typewriters rattled from early morning until late at night. In one of those rooms, a clerk in his 20s worked through piles of forms and signal copies. He was not a planner in the grand sense. He did not choose targets or draft strategy. His job was to register incoming messages, update tables, and make sure that every amendment reached the right folders and the right people. Most of his day passed in routine. He logged signals in a register. He clipped paper to cardboard files. He typed new versions of landing tables when the planners altered timings, serials, or craft assignments. Amphibious warfare by 1943 had become a matter of elaborate arithmetic. Infantry, engineers, vehicles, guns, and supplies all had to be matched to landing craft, each with its own capacity and limitations. Every change in one figure forced changes elsewhere. If a company gained extra mortars, weights shifted. And if tides at the target beach narrowed the landing window, timings across the entire sequence had to be adjusted. For the course staff, the new operation was just one among several possibilities. Higher headquarters had requested options. This raid-like landing was meant to be ready as a way to stretch enemy coastal defences, to exploit any sign of weakness, or to support larger operations in other theatres. The clerk's first contact with it was a thin file arriving from combined operations. Inside were a short appreciation of the harbour, some reconnaissance photographs, and a draft scheme of manoeuvre. The cover sheet gave the operation a code word and an initial target date. From there, the file began to grow. Engineers added notes about piers and cranes, naval officers attached comments on shoals, swell and tidal streams. Yet intelligence staff inserted estimates of local garrisons. Every addition meant more paper, more copies, more opportunities for error. The training units earmarked for the assault were already on the coast, using nearby beaches as practice grounds. For them, this was another exercise in a long series. They had been in and out of landing craft for months. They rehearsed scrambling over ramps, forming up on shingle, and pushing inland against imaginary resistance. Officers reminded them that one day the practice would stop and the real thing would come. But the men seldom knew which specific plan their current rehearsals supported. In the amphibious section, the early signs of strain were subtle. The first landing tables, produced in haste, contained small discrepancies. A battalion's strength on one page did not quite match its strength on another. The number of vehicles listed for a support company differed between two drafts. A landing craft serial appeared twice. Normally such things were caught and corrected in the next revision. Corrections were routine, so were delays. The clerk took phone calls from officers complaining that their copies were out of date. He marked old versions with diagonal red lines and wrote, "Cancelled, see latest issue" across them. But older copies were not always destroyed. In offices along the corridor, and in bivouac huts nearer the training beaches, staff kept sets of papers in their own folders, in their own order. Each revision risked leaving some out of step. The system relied on distribution lists. Every time a landing table changed, the clerk consulted a typed list of offices and units entitled to receive the updated version. He counted copies, watched the duplicating machine grind out fresh sheets, checked them against the list, and sent them out by dispatch rider. When the operation was first proposed, the distribution was small. As more arms and services became involved, the list expanded. More initials, more compartments, more hands on the paper. The operational situation around it was fluid. Allied resources were stretched between the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and preparations for eventual landings in Western Europe. Landing craft were a constant point of contention. The Admiralty, various army headquarters, and combined operations all had claims on the available fleets of LCTs, LCIs, and smaller craft, and that the operation to seize the minor harbour assumed that a certain number of craft would be ring-fenced for it in a given week. Those assumptions appeared as small numbers in the tables the clerk updated. At first, the figures seemed firm, then the signals began to arrive. One message from a naval command indicated that a portion of the craft was to be temporarily loaned to support a different training commitment. Another suggested that certain assault craft might be required elsewhere if other plans moved forward more quickly. These signals were not, in themselves, cancellation orders. Each change looked temporary. Each adjustment could be handled with a new table. The clerk entered the details in his register and marked the operation file with notes. He typed a new page adjusting craft serials and capacities. He did not decide whether the plan was viable. He merely reflected the latest information. But as the weeks passed, the rhythm of change intensified. Training continued on the beaches. Men boarded craft, disembarked under blank fire, and practiced clearing dummy obstacles. In the offices, paper piled higher. One afternoon, a set of aerial photographs arrived showing the target harbour from a new angle. Comparing them to earlier images, an intelligence officer noted what might be additional anti-landing obstacles in the approaches. He dictated an amendment. Beach sectors were renamed. Recommended landing points shifted a few hundred yards. The alteration rippled through multiple tables. Ships, craft, and infantry now had to be matched to new beaches with slightly different gradients and sand conditions. The clerk placed the intelligence note on his growing stack of pending amendments. At the same time, he had to deal with an unrelated change, a reorganization of the brigade selected as assault force. One company swapped its heavy weapons, another received additional carriers, weights and spaces changed. The amphibious planners pressed for updated strengths. The brigade staff sent numbers in two separate signals, their totals not quite matching. All of this required attention before the next consolidated issue of landing tables. The clerk stayed late, retyping columns by lamplight. In the training area, the men saw only the outward signs of planning. Trucks brought in new equipment, officers reminded them of security. Rumours circulated about where the landing might be. Some believed it would be in France. Others guessed Norway or the Low Countries. A few suspected it was simply another rehearsal for something much larger to come. On paper, the situation grew more complicated. The Corps headquarters received a directive to prepare alternative schemes if higher command reassigned certain naval assets. This did not cancel the harbour plan, but it introduced a hierarchy of importance. Other operations were ranked higher. The harbour assault would only proceed if sufficient craft remained after those priorities were met. The directive arrived as a multi-page signal, full of cross-references and codewords. The clerk registered it and placed it in a lever arch file. He highlighted the paragraph that concerned his section, then the phone rang. An officer from another branch wanted clarification on a movement table for a different exercise. By the time the clerk returned to his desk, the new directive lay among several other documents awaiting full action. The days that followed were busy. A major exercise inland demanded temporary diversion of staff attention. Another set of landing drills had to be supported with paperwork. The harbour operation file did not vanish. It simply shared space with multiple demands. Gradually the gap widened between what the latest official papers said and what various officers believed to be the case. Some still worked from early versions of tables. Others kept annotated copies reflecting local changes agreed by telephone but not yet incorporated into a central document. The system relied on the assumption that all significant alterations would be captured, typed, duplicated and distributed in sequence. That assumption proved fragile. A key stage in the planning process was the joint conference between Army, Navy and Air representatives, where craft allocations and timings would be harmonized. Before that, each side worked from its own figures, drawn from earlier agreements and more recent signals. In the weeks before the conference, a critical message was sent from naval authorities to clarify the availability of a group of landing craft. Due to the pressure on fleets in another theatre, they proposed to withdraw several craft during the very window assigned to the harbour operation. The signal, encoded and dispatched, reached Corps headquarters and was decoded in the communication centre. It was then sent up to the registry for logging and distribution. There the clerk entered its reference number into the large ledger that tracked incoming messages, but under the pressure of time and with several similar operations being discussed, the clerk misread or misheard one element of the reference. The operation code in the ledger was written with one digit transposed. The signal bearing the correct text but now mislabelled in the register was placed in the wrong file. It joined papers for a different contingency plan that was already slipping down the list of priorities. Thus, the naval proposal to withdraw key landing craft never reached the amphibious planners responsible for the harbour operation. In their tables, the craft remained assigned. On the naval side, the further staff assumed that their message had been received and would be reflected in updated Army documents. When no such revision appeared in their in-trays, they inferred that the Army had accepted the reduced allocation and was adjusting plans accordingly. Between the two assumptions, a gap opened. Training at the beaches continued on the basis of craft numbers that no longer existed on the naval schedules. Officers rehearsed loading drills for vehicles that would have no place on real landing craft if the operation went ahead. Within the Corps headquarters, other signs of strain emerged. The engineer section submitted a reconnaissance report from a small vessel that had examined the approaches to the target harbour at night. They confirmed the existence of more obstacles than originally believed. Their timings for the clearance work would need to be extended. The report arrived as a bulky folder, with diagrams and sketches attached. By the time it reached the Amphibious section, the clerk's in-tray was already piled high. He stamped the engineer report with the date and filed it temporarily among incoming documents awaiting action. Telephone calls interrupted his attempts to sort the stack. Messages about exercise timings, requests for extra copies of tables, and queries from other branches competed for attention. The engineer report waited. The operation's target date, meanwhile, approached on the calendar. Moon and tide tables fixed a limited window. Beyond that, conditions would no longer favour a night approach and dawn landing of the type envisioned. Moving the date would require a fresh cycle of approvals, and any delay might conflict with other planned operations. The amphibious planners, unaware of the naval withdrawal or the engineer report's full implications, continued to refine timings, unit tasks, and routes inland land from the beach. They produced neat diagrams showing platoons unrolling across contours, supply points marked with small symbols, and engineer teams clearing obstacles according to a schedule that no longer matched reality. On the ground, some officers began to express doubts. They noticed that vehicles allotted for later waves seemed to exceed the lift available in the small craft they expected to use. They wrote marginal notes on their copies and raised the issue with liaison officers. In theory, such concerns should have climbed back up the chain and triggered a review of the master tables. In practice, much depended on who was available, who answered which call, and what papers lay closest to hand when questions were asked. At one coordination meeting, a staff officer reassured a battalion commander that additional craft would be found or that adjustments would be made at the final conference. The battalion commander accepted this, knowing that the war was full of improvisations, the landing that never was moved nearer, shaped by incomplete information. When the joint conference finally convened, representatives gathered around a large table. Army planners brought their stacks of landing tables. Naval officers laid out charts and lists of craft. Air Force personnel contributed schedules for bombing and reconnaissance. The clerk was not present, yet his part had been to ensure that the documents on the table reflected the latest signals. He believed they did. The meeting began with formalities. Participants reviewed the broad concept: night approach, pre-dawn landings, rapid demolition of key targets, withdrawal under cover of naval gunfire and fighter patrols. As discussion moved to the detailed landing sequence, the first serious discrepancy appeared. A naval officer noted that a particular group of landing craft, listed on the Army's tables for the first wave, did not appear in his own allocation lists for that week. He assumed there had been a change since his last copy and asked for clarification. Army staff explained that, according to their records, those craft had been committed months earlier and had never been withdrawn. The naval officer referred to the signal sent from his command proposing their temporary reassignment. Army planners insisted they had received no such formal withdrawal. After a pause, they agreed to adjourn briefly while staff searched for the relevant messages. Messengers left the room. Minutes later, registry staff delivered the ledger and several files. The transposed reference number emerged. The naval signal had been logged against the wrong operation. It had never been incorporated into the harbour plan's records. In the file where it did appear, no one had acted upon it because that contingency plan was already considered dormant. On the spot, the planners faced an unwelcome reality. The craft they had assumed available in their first 2 landing waves were in fact committed elsewhere. An alternative craft might be found, but not without affecting other exercises and operations, and not without redoing much of the detailed loading work. The conference continued, but the tone changed. Each subsequent figure on the tables was examined more sceptically. Further mismatches came to light. Some vehicle weights did not match naval capacity notes. Some timings assumed clearance of beach obstacles at a speed that the still unread engineer report would not have supported. Hundreds of hours of staff work had gone into the plan, but a chain of small clerical and procedural lapses had left its foundations uncertain. By the end of the meeting, confidence in the plan had weakened considerably. No formal cancellation was declared that day. Instead, as the operation was subject to further review in the light of resource constraints. Behind that phrase lay the uncomfortable fact that what existed on paper did not correspond reliably to what existed at sea. Back at the Corps headquarters, the Amphibious section worked late into the night. The clerk and his colleagues were instructed to cross-check every signal associated with the harbour operation. They opened drawers, pulled out bundles of copies, and turned pages in the ledger. At last, the engineer report was retrieved from the in-tray and placed on the planners' desks. Its contents reinforced the doubts. The obstacles in the approaches were more extensive than expected. Clearance would require more time and more specialised equipment. Those resources would, in turn, need craft space and loading priority. In theory, the plan could still be altered to accommodate these realities. But doing so would require time, additional conferences, and further coordination with commands already heavily engaged in other operations. The calendar pages did not move. The tide tables remained fixed. Inside the Amphibious section, one senior staff officer came to a quiet conclusion. He did not issue an order beyond his authority. He did not declare the operation dead, but he decided that until every discrepancy was resolved on paper, he would not recommend committing troops to the sea. He insisted on a complete reconciliation of the tables before endorsing the next stage. That demand, made in an office rather than a conference hall, had consequences. The process of reconciliation proved slow, and every attempt to straighten one line of figures revealed another thread of uncertainty. Some could be solved. Others would have required changes beyond the Corps' control. As days passed, the target date slipped beyond the originally planned window. Officially, the reason was competing demands on resources. Unofficially, staff recognised that the plan had been overtaken by its own administrative weaknesses. On the training beaches, the change filtered down in simple words. Units were told to stand down from intensive rehearsals for the unnamed operation. There would be no embarkation in the near future. Other duties awaited. For some soldiers, the news brought relief. They were tired of climbing in and out of craft in miserable weather. For others, it brought a sense of anticlimax. They had steeled themselves for a hazardous assault that would now never take place. A few remembered fallen comrades who had died in training accidents during amphibious exercises. Those losses now seemed linked to an operation that had vanished on paper. In Corps headquarters, the final act of cancellation took the form of signals. Higher authorities, considering the state of resources and the growing demands of other theatres, decided that the harbour raid need not proceed. The reasons listed were broad: shifts in strategic priorities, availability of landing craft, need to concentrate forces for larger operations. No single line referred to the misfiled signal or the delayed engineer report. The clerk typed the outgoing messages conveying the decision to the units concerned. Then he marked the operation file with the relevant dates and moved it to a stack of completed or cancelled plans. In the ledger, a brief entry recorded that the operation had been suspended indefinitely. In one sense, the failure was minor. No ships were lost offshore. No salt wave was caught on open beaches. In another sense, it revealed how fragile complex operations could be when dependent on paperwork. The chain of events did not centre on a dramatic betrayal or a single catastrophic mistake. It consisted of small errors of reference, delays in handling reports, and assumptions made by staffs under pressure. Each by itself seemed trivial, Together they undermined a plan that had appeared sound in outline. Within the headquarters, there was some quiet examination of what had gone wrong. Staff officers reviewed their procedures for registering and distributing signals. New instructions were issued emphasizing the need for careful checking of operation codewords and reference numbers. Distribution lists were revised. In some offices, older copies of tables were collected and destroyed to reduce confusion. These changes did not become famous reforms, they appeared in memoranda, not in histories. The clerk continued his work. He was not formally blamed for the misfiled signal. His error had been one link in a chain, and in wartime many such links existed. But he felt the weight of it. For months afterward, he was known among some colleagues for double-checking every reference number and insisting on clear labels. Future operation files under his care bore neat, careful markings. At the training beaches, though the skills honed for the cancelled landing were not wasted. The same units, or parts of them, would later embark for other operations. They would board craft again, under different codewords, bound for other coasts. In diaries and letters, some men mentioned the earlier period of intense amphibious rehearsal that had led nowhere. They remembered evenings when they had wondered why so many drills ended in postponement. In their words, the cancelled operation became the landing that never was. The harbour itself did not remain untouched by the war. Later advances captured or bypassed it by more conventional means. When that happened, the troops involved knew nothing of the aborted raid months earlier. For them, it was simply another objective on a long march. In archives, the earlier plan survives only as a thin folder. And inside are drafts of tables, copies of signals, and the final notes of suspension. The documents show careful handwriting, typed columns, and rubber stamps. They also show corrections, crossings out, and revision marks. They are the visible traces of a story in which no landing craft ever dropped ramps on that particular beach. For historians studying the period, such files offer a glimpse of how much of the war remained on paper. Many schemes were pursued up to a point and then abandoned. Some died because conditions changed, some because higher priorities intervened. A few, like this one, failed under the combined weight of clerical strain, imperfect communication, and the sheer complexity of coordinating land, sea, and air. The story is not one of dramatic heroism, it is one of routine, pressure, and fallible systems. The anonymous clerk in the Amphibious section never led a charge. Yet his work and the limits of the system in which he worked contributed to the shape of the campaign as surely as the actions of more visible figures. The men who trained for the cancelled landing carried that experience forward into the operations that did occur. They did not know that a misplaced digit in a ledger and a delayed report had helped decide their immediate fate. They simply remembered weeks of boarding and disembarking, and a day when the orders changed. In the quiet of post-war years, the files remained. Occasionally, an officer giving a lecture on staff work would refer in general terms to the dangers of unchecked revisions and poorly managed signals. He would speak of the need for clear chains of responsibility, of central master documents, and of firm reconciliation before any operation was allowed to proceed. He might not name the harbour or the code word, but the lesson came from lived experience. The cancelled amphibious scheme left no battle honour on regimental colours. It left no memorial on the shoreline it never reached. Its legacy lay instead in the invisible adjustments of procedure, in the quiet caution of clerks and staff officers who remembered how quickly tables could drift from reality. In the history of the Second World War, victories and defeats at sea often draw attention. Less visible are the landings that never took place because plans dissolved in the files before they ever touched water. This story belongs to that quieter category. It shows how war depended not only on courage in the surf, but also on the accuracy of figures in columns and the journey of a single piece of paper through a crowded office. Remembering it is a way of acknowledging the unseen labour, and the unnoticed failures that shape the conflict's course. For viewers who wish to hear more about these overlooked corners of the war, and the people whose work seldom reach the headlines, supporting the channel by subscribing helps bring such stories to light.